When I heard the sounds coming from my mother's bedroom, I thought I was dreaming. But dreams don't sound like him whispering my name. That was the night my love and my blood betrayed me together. I stood in the dark hallway barefoot, the floor cool and clean beneath my toes, the scent of lavender cleaner still hanging from the air like a memory I wanted to suffocate. The glow from the nightlight in the bathroom carved a dim triangle on the carpet, enough to show me the dust motes drifting like slow snow. I remember the clock in the living room clicking through the seconds, loud and mechanical, like a patient tapping his finger on a hospital tray. It was late, or early, a nowhere hour when the world is quiet and the monsters finally feel brave. At first I told myself it was the television. Maybe she fell asleep with one of her old shows on, the ones where laughter sounds canned and distant like it was recorded for other people's lives. But then the laugh came again, and it was not a laugh from a television. It was a breath, unsteady and soft, and then that whisper, my name in the voice I knew better than my own. He said it the way he always did, like a promise and a warning. I did not think. I didn't turn on the hallway light. I moved forward, each step careful and slow, as if the thick carpet could betray me too. The door was closed, but not fully. A narrow crack glowed with the gold of her bedside lamp. Through it, I saw a slice of the old oak dresser. The top was covered in the familiar clutter of my childhood home. A framed photo of me with missing front teeth, a porcelain tray with her rings, a crystal bottle of perfume that had always smelled like comfort until it didn't. Their voices were low, intimate, the kind of low you use when the world is sleeping and you want to keep it that way. My name again. His voice. Then hers, my mother's. A hush I had always trusted. The same voice that had soothed nightmares and fevers, now washing over the man I was supposed to marry. My hand went to the door jamb and I pressed my palm against the groove in the wood where our old dog had scratched years ago, the indentations smooth as coins. It anchored me for a second. Then I pushed the door. I have replayed the way the door opened 1,000 times in my mind. The slow swing, the widening light, the way both of their heads turned, twin amazements, two faces lit by guilt like sudden moonlight. He was behind her. She was in front of me, a sheet like a surrendered flag wrapped to her waist. His hands, the ones that had held me when I cried and held me when I laughed, were on her shoulders. And my name hung in the air like incense that would not disappear no matter how hard I waved it away. There are details the brain preserves in amber forever. The small things. Her wedding ring on the porcelain tray instead of her finger. The blue vein at my boyfriend's temple beating like a trapped moth. The shadow of the ceiling fan moving lazily across their skin as if it wanted to shield them and could not. Somewhere down the street a siren wailed and then died as if the city had taken a breath, prepared for a scream that never came. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw anything. I stood there in the doorway, the wooden floor cold under my bare feet where the carpet ended, and I felt my body shift around me like a house settling into its foundations. Something inside me hardened, a core, a stone. He reached for me first with words. Baby, it was nothing. We were drunk. We were talking, and then he trailed off, eyes begging my mercy like a child caught with chocolate on his face, denying the cake was touched. My mother's hands went to her mouth. She said my name and then said, please, please. Let me explain. As if there could be a version of the story I had just walked in on that would unmake the images burned onto the back of my eyelids. I turned and walked away without a word. Their voices followed me down the hallway like thrown ropes, tugging, pleading, tripping over each other. I did not look back. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, and slid the lock with a click that sounded like the start of a clock. My face in the mirror was someone else's. Pale, eyes too wide, jaw clenched so tight I could feel the pulse in my molars. I turned on the sink. I let the water run and run until the sound filled the room and covered the echoes. Then I twisted it off and listened to the sudden quiet. The quiet was worse. It left me alone with the truth. The next morning, the house smelled like coffee, like it always did after a hard night, my mother's prescription for grief and illness alike. She sat at the kitchen table with 2 mugs and eyes that wanted a past I could no longer hand back. He sat at the end of the table, shoulders curved inward, like he had been folded wrong and could not remember how to open. The light through the window was too bright, the sun too healthy and innocent for what we had done tonight. I did not sit. I stood by the counter and wrapped my hands around the edge until my fingers turned white. Tell me, I said. And they began. He said it started with talking. He used that word like a bandage, talking as if talk could not cut. He said she was lonely. He said he was struggling. He said they were drunk that first time. He said the second time they were sober but sad. He said the third time was a mistake. He promised there was no fourth. My mother's mouth pressed into a line so thin it almost disappeared. She stared at the table and talked about grief as if it were a cold that can be shared and then recovered from. She said she did not know why. She said she hated herself. She said she loved me. She kept saying she loved me until the words were just sounds. I listened because listening is what daughters do. I listened because I wanted to collect every lie and every half-truth and place them in the same box and label it a word that matched. I listened because silence would be the last gift I gave them, and it needed to be exact. Then I asked him to leave. He began to protest, but my mother told him to go. He gathered his shoes like a thief gathering stolen things and walked out the door into the stupid, generous sunshine. When it closed behind him, the house shrank. The air thinned. It was only the two of us now, mother and daughter, a shape that once meant safety and now meant a cliff edge. She reached for me, and I stepped away. Her hand hovered uselessly in the space between us, the way you hover over a flame to see how close you can get before you burn. "You cannot hold me and be the reason I need to be held," I said. The words surprised us both. I did not plan them. They rose up from the new, hard place inside me, the stone center that had formed in the doorway hours before. She cried. I watched. I do not say that with pride. I say it the way a person would describe the weather. It was raining, and I did not own an umbrella for her anymore. The days that followed were sharp and bright and slow. I went to work and performed my tasks like a very exact ghost. I returned home and moved around the edges of the house, avoiding the bedroom with the oak dresser and the perfume, avoiding the framed photos. My mother tried to talk, then tried not to talk, then tried again. We were two people in an apartment that felt like a museum of a family we used to be. People came and went. A neighbor brought a casserole because, in our building, grief always tasted like baked pasta. My mother smiled too wide. I said thank you too softly. The casserole grew cold on the counter and then colder in the trash. He texted me. He called. He sent long messages that looked like confessions and short ones that looked like prayers. I did not block him. I read every word and let each one dissolve into the salt of my mouth like medicine I did not swallow. He said he would explain. He said he would marry me still. He said he was sick with regret. I imagined regret as a fever and hoped it burned. I imagined it as salt in his coffee and hoped he tasted it every morning. I did not answer. Each silence I sent was a letter in a sentence that would end him. On the third day, one of his messages mentioned my mother in a way that made my fingers go cold. He said she needed me. He said she was breaking. He said he was worried about her. The audacity of his concern wrapped around me like a wet sheet, clinging and damp and impossible to tear. He wrote her name the way he wrote mine when he first told me he loved me. I deleted the message and then dug it out of the deleted folder and read it again, because hatred and curiosity share a spine. That night, I walked into my mother's room and opened the drawers. I did not do it gently. The wood complained and the handles clicked against their stoppers. I took out the perfume bottle and opened it, letting the scent rise and burn the back of my throat. I took out the framed photo of me with missing front teeth and placed it face down on the dresser. I took out the old Polaroids of my parents, the ones where my father is still alive, and I tucked them into the bottom of the nightstand drawer because I did not want my father to watch what I was planning. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for my mother to come home from her late shift at the clinic, where she filed papers and smiled at old men. When she came in and saw me there, she stopped. We stared at each other the way you stare at a reflection that suddenly moves differently than you do. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it as if it were the only solid thing in the room. I told her I needed her phone. She hesitated, and then she handed it to me. The passcode was my birthday, which felt like a joke that had gotten too old to be funny. I opened her messages. The truth was a neat little thread of bubbles. Words that should not exist between them curved politely in gray and blue. They had their own language now, private and spoiled. I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled until my stomach knotted. I stopped on a voice memo. I did not press play. I didn't need to hear. The words were enough. He wrote to her about the way I bite my bottom lip when I am thinking. He wrote as if he discovered me, as if he were offering my secrets to her like stolen jewels. She responded with recipes and tenderness and things I will not write here because they were not meant for daughter's eyes. I took a breath that shook the way a building shakes before it falls. I asked her one question. If I had not opened the door, would you have told me? She said yes, and then no, and then the truth, which is that she did not know. Her shoulders folded, her face collapsed into itself. She said my name as if it were a prayer that required kneeling. I nodded, as if she had confirmed a weather report. Then I watched myself from far away as I did something I did not expect. I put the phone back in her hand and said, "You are going to help me end this." She blinked at me as if light had struck her retinas. She asked what I meant. I told her I would not scream or break things or disappear. I said I would not give them the drama of my pain or the spectacle of my grief. I would give them something simpler and more terrible. I would give them the truth where it would cost them most. I told her she would confess to my family. I told her she would do it with me standing beside her. I told her she would say his name out loud and let it fall across the table like blood from a cut. She said no. She said please. She said not your grandmother, not your aunt, not the people who loved your father. I sat very still and let each no fall into the room and break. Then I said yes. Yes, you will. Because you did this in the dark, and I am dragging it into the light where it belongs. I stood up. The mattress rose and sighed without me. I walked to the door. I could feel her fear behind me like heat from an oven. I did not turn around. I told her dinner would be Sunday. I did not ask. I announced. Then I left and closed the door with the quiet dignity of a guillotine blade. The days between now and Sunday became a place I visited without really living there. I did what I always do when the world refuses to make sense. I made lists, not on paper, in my head, a list of who would be there. My grandmother, with her rosary slipping through her fingers like a leather snake. My aunt, who laughed too loudly and loved too easily. My cousin, who adored my boyfriend because he was charming at cookouts and carried groceries for old neighbors. I added the neighbor to the list because I wanted the world to witness itself. I wanted the world to see how it devours daughters and then pretends it does not. I called everyone. I used the word dinner. I used the word family. I used the word celebration. I used my voice as bait. In the evenings, I practiced not shaking. I practiced breathing through the thoughts that pressed against my chest like doors I could not open. When I finally slept, I dreamed of a hallway that never ended and a whisper that never stopped. I woke with my jaw aching and my nails marked in my palms. On Saturday, he came to the door with flowers. They were white lilies, the kind you bring to funerals and apologies. I opened the door and stood in the frame and watched him with the patience of a hunter who already knows where the animal will step. He said my name. He tried to hand me the bouquet, but my hands stayed at my sides. He smiled the smile that had gotten him through life like a forged pass. I watched it fall apart on his face when it did nothing to me. He asked to come in. I said no. He asked to talk. I said we would talk tomorrow at dinner. He looked confused, then hopeful, the way stupid men do when they mistake strategy for forgiveness. He asked if it would just be the two of us. I said it would be family. His eyes flickered. He realized something was wrong and then chose not to realize it because denial is easier to hold than a burning truth. He tried to kiss my forehead the way he used to when we were new. I stepped back and the lilies wobbled in his fist like a nervous apology. He dropped them when he put his hands up in surrender. The petals bruised on the floor. He left with the stems still in his palms, and I watched him go to his car and sit there too long. Then he drove away, and the silence he left behind tasted like the aftershock of thunder. Sunday morning arrived with vulgar sunshine, birds advertising their simple, faithful lives. I showered and let the water run hot until the mirror fogged completely, and I could not see myself at all. I dressed in simple black like a nod to what was being buried. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother preparing food with the carefulness of a person defusing a bomb. She was making my grandmother's beef stew, her hands moving by memory, the rhythm a language older than words. The smell pulled me back to childhood, to winter nights when the world outside was cruel and the kitchen was a fortress. I wanted to be a child again so badly my knees almost gave. I steadied myself against the counter because I am not a child, and fortresses fall. We did not speak. We moved around each other like strangers on a subway platform. At noon, the doorbell began to ring in friendly little bursts. We opened and welcomed and hugged and poured drinks. People put on their best faces, the ones they keep polished for gatherings. It felt like a play we were staging in a house that had been a theater for too long. My grandmother gave my cheek a kiss that smelled like powder and peppermint and asked if I was happy. I told her I was fine, so smoothly it scared me. When he arrived, he looked like a man who had borrowed a suit from a better life. He hugged my aunt and shook my uncle's hand and turned toward me with a smile that asked 1,000 questions and begged none of them. I offered him nothing. He moved through the room like a polite storm, touching shoulders, laughing too loudly, making jokes about traffic, the way people do to prove they belong in the room. Dinner seated itself, plates filled and emptied. The chatter rose and fell and rose. At the head of the table, my grandmother told a story about the first time she met my grandfather, how he had shown up with roses and mud on his shoes because he had walked 3 miles through the rain when the bus never came. People laughed, glasses clinked, forks scraped. This is what families do. They circle around food and pretend that food is a cure. I waited until the stew bowls were empty and the dessert plates were not yet filled. I waited until the air was comfortable, until the room had curled itself into a contented yawn. Then I set my spoon down, and the small sound of it tapping the porcelain was louder to me than a gunshot. I looked at my mother. The light from the chandelier made a small halo of her gray hairs and carved deeper shadows into the lines beside her mouth. She met my eyes. If there had been love between us in that moment, we killed it together. Tell them, I said. Silence makes a sound. It is the kind of sound that happens just after you slam the door of a house and you are outside on the porch with your keys still inside. It is a tight sound, a clench. Around the table, heads tilted. Someone laughed a confused little laugh because the moment felt like a joke, and we are built to prefer jokes. My mother reached for her water and took a sip, as if moisture could carry courage. Then she placed the glass down, and it left a wet ring on the tablecloth like a moon around a planet. She cleared her throat. She said my name. She said, "There is something I have to tell you." She looked at my grandmother, and her face changed in a way I will never forgive. She said his name. The room leaned in toward her the way flowers lean toward light. I watched his face as she spoke. I watched the first flicker of fear and the way he smoothed it over with charm, and the way charm failed like a cheap plaster over a crack in a foundation. My mother's voice trembled, and then steadied, and then broke again as she opened the door to her own shame and invited our family to stand in the hallway and stare. She said words she never should have had to say. She said, "I am sorry," and it was not enough and never will be. Then I took the phone I had hidden under the table and placed it on the tablecloth. My hands did not shake. I pressed play on a message that did not need to be played, but I played it anyway because theater requires sound. His voice filled the room, too loud and too intimate, saying things he had no right to say the way he said them. It was not explicit. It did not need to be. It was the tone. It was the ownership. It was the easy cruelty. He said my name to my mother in a way that made my aunt gasp, and my uncle say Jesus beneath his breath like an apology. My grandmother's rosary stopped moving through her fingers. The neighbor's fork clattered against her plate. Around the table, heads turned toward him, not as a boyfriend and not as a man, but as a proof of something that people pretend does not happen because pretending is easier to live inside than the truth. He stood up so fast, his chair legs scratched the floor like a scream. He began to speak. He used the word mistake as if mistakes can put themselves in beds and press their bodies together. He used the words, "not what it seems," as if the human eye had suddenly failed all of us at once. He used my name in a way that reached toward me across a gulf I had opened and that would never close. My mother cried, not the performative cry of earlier days. A true, ugly, breaking cry that belongs in bathrooms and closets, and not at tables dressed with good china. She reached for me with her eyes because her hands were useless. I sat very still and felt the stone at my core glow with a calm light that did not warm me and did not need to. I let him talk until he ran out of words, and then I turned to my grandmother and spoke to her the way you speak to the oldest truth in a room. I told her the facts without adjectives. I told her what I had seen and what I had read. I told her how long. I told her I did not know how many times because counting is for accountants and grief is not math. I told her we were done pretending that the world is kinder than it is. I told her I had invited them here because secrets rot the house that holds them, and I will not live in a rotten house. My grandmother looked at me the way a lighthouse looks at the storm. Her eyes were sharp and wet. She did not look at him. She did not look at my mother for long. She looked at me and said, "You are not the one who should be ashamed." Then she set her rosary on the table, like a judge sets a gavel down, and with that simple movement, the room chose its side. He left first, grabbing his jacket, face red with the shame that finally realized it had an audience. He knocked his glass over and it bled across the tablecloth. It looked like wine and then like something else. He muttered apologies to no one and someone, and then the front door closed and the apartment exhaled. My aunt went to the kitchen without a word and returned with towels, as if floods are best answered by fabric. My uncle whispered something into my grandmother's hair that I could not hear. The neighbor stared at the lilies in the trash and said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the only mercy. My mother stayed seated. Her hands were flat on the table, palms down, as if she were bracing for an earthquake. She tried to hold her spine straight and failed. She was a cliff eroding in front of me. I watched and did not look away. She finally turned her head and met my eyes, and in that moment I saw every version of her at once. The mother who braided my hair before school while coffee steamed in a chipped mug. The woman who yelled at my father when he drank too much and then cried into his shirts while doing laundry. The human being who had made a choice she could not unmake and would not recover from. I saw them all, and I did not know which one to bury. People left in ripples. My grandmother kissed my cheek and whispered something that sounded like a prayer and a promise. My aunt hugged me too hard. The neighbor patted my arm the way you pat a dog after a storm. The front door opened and closed and opened and closed, and then it was only us again, mother and daughter, in a kitchen that smelled like stew and cheap wine and ruin. She said my name one more time. I said, "I am tired." She nodded, a tiny motion like a leaf surrendering to gravity. I went to my room and closed the door and sat on the bed and let my body feel the weight of itself for the first time in a week. The quiet came back. It did not scare me anymore. It sat beside me like a new animal I would have to learn. My phone buzzed. Messages stacked themselves like bricks. Friends, family, cousin, aunt. "Are you okay? What happened? Do you need anything?" I stared at them and felt a strange, clean space inside me where anger had lived all week. The stone at my core did not recede. It simply cooled. I typed back answers that were short and exact. I told them I was safe. I told them I was done with him. I told them I needed a few days. I turned the phone face down and watched the tiny notification light flash in the dark like a lighthouse that had been furloughed. In the morning, I made coffee and drank it on the stoop because the kitchen was still a crime scene in my blood. The air had that after-rain smell even though there had been no rain. Across the street, a child chased a stray balloon that had escaped a party and was trying to join the clouds. I watched him run and laugh and leave his mother behind, trusting that the string in his hand was enough to pull home back to him whenever he wanted it. He was wrong, but he would not learn that for years, and I was glad for his ignorance. My mother came out and sat on the step below me. She did not touch me. We stared at the street as if it were a television show about other people's lives. She asked me what happens now, her voice barely a voice. I said, "Now you tell your friends. Now you tell your sister. Now you tell your priest if you need to. Now you tell the truth until it is exhausted and has to lie down." She nodded as if I had given her a recipe, and maybe I had. You boil shame in salt water until the bitterness dissolves or the house burns, whichever comes first. I called him later that day. The sound of his voice on the other end made memories stand up in my body like a reflex. He said my name with that same mixture of plead and possess, as if saying my name created ownership papers. I told him he would not contact my mother again. I told him I would forward any messages he sent her to his boss and his mother and his brother and his best friend, because truth belongs to the people who were told the lie. I told him to gather whatever he had at my place within the hour, because if he did not, the trash would adopt it. He tried to argue. He tried to cry. He tried to say he loved me. I let him talk until he ran out of verbs. Then I hung up and went to the bedroom and opened drawers and packed his things into a black bag the way coroners pack the personal effects of the dead. At exactly the hour I had given him, I carried the bag downstairs and set it on the sidewalk. He arrived in a flurry of apology and cologne. I remained on the stoop with my coffee, legs crossed, the queen of a small ruined kingdom. He reached for the bag and then for me. I leaned back. He said he would change. I said, "Good, change somewhere else." He said he would never forgive himself. I said, "That makes one of us." He stared at me with a hunger that used to feel like love and now looked like a man begging at the wrong door. I pointed to the street. He lifted the bag, heavy with all the versions of our life that did not survive, and walked away. He did not look back. I did not either. Night settled without incident. The house was quiet. My mother moved through it like a ghost, trying to show the living where the knives are kept. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I did not drink, and picked up the framed photo of me with no front teeth and set it upright again. The child I had been stared at me like a witness, giving a testimony at the end of a long trial. I looked back and said, "We made it to the verdict." I thought I would feel triumphant. I thought the public unmasking would fill the empty space revenge promises to fill. Instead, I felt precise, not happy, not even relieved, just exact. The truth was where it belonged. It had been dragged from a bed and laid on a table and given a name and a shape and a weight. It could not hurt me in the same way anymore. It would find new ways. That was tomorrow's problem. I went to bed and turned off the light and lay there in the dark breathing, like a person who has learned a new language in a week and can now ask for water and shelter, but not yet poetry. I wanted poetry back someday. I wanted to stand in a room with a window open and not think about doors. I wanted to laugh and not look around for someone to measure it. I wanted to wear my mother's perfume again and not choke on the memory. Sleep arrived like a stray animal that finally accepts your open palm. I let it climb onto the bed and curl against my knees. I dreamed of an ocean and a shoreline that kept changing shape every time the waves came in. I walked along it and collected small stones made of glass that the sea had worn smooth. And when I woke, I held the memory of their cool weight in my hand and knew I would keep walking until the shoreline stopped moving. This is not the end. Endings are neat. Life is not. Monday brings bills and emails and the act of feeding a body that does not want to be a body today. Monday brings my mother's footsteps in the hall and a soft knock on my door and the long work of learning how to live in a house with a woman who once saved me from nightmares and then became one. Monday brings the knowledge that justice is not a feeling but a practice, and revenge is not a feast but a ration you eat slowly so it lasts through winter. But Sunday gave me what I needed. Sunday put truth on the table and invited everyone to see. Sunday gave my grandmother a line to say that I will fold and keep in my mouth for days when it tastes like metal again. You are not the one who should be ashamed. I will carry that sentence like a match and light it whenever the darkness tries to move back in. I will not forgive them. Not today. Maybe not ever. Forgiveness is a language for people who were lied to in smaller ways. I will not fight with them either. Fighting is intimacy. I am done offering my throat to people who like the taste of it. I will learn to live with the quiet that comes after the storm, and love the way the city sounds through the window at 2 in the morning, when a siren wails and then gives up, and the clock in the living room counts on and on and on. The stone at my core is still there. It is not heavy anymore. It is simply part of the architecture. It holds me upright. It reminds me who I am when I am tempted to soften for the sake of people who did not soften for me. It keeps me steady when I pass the perfume counter and the air tilts. It keeps me walking forward through the kind of night that taught me how to see in the dark. When I think about that night now, I allow myself only 3 sentences, and I say them the way a witness says what she saw without decoration. I walked down the hallway. I opened the door. I did not scream. And sometimes, when it is very late and the house is kind, I let myself add a 4th. I planned their ending and gave it to them in daylight, and I did not look away. The first week after the dinner blurred into a map of small rituals. I would wake up, make coffee, and sit on the stoop as if I were choosing a life from a catalog. Then I would come back in and do one definitive thing. I would live in the house that remained, not the house that had been stolen. I learned to move through rooms like a trained animal, avoiding traps of memory. I made the bed, I folded laundry, I paid the bills, I watered the plant my father had once brought home and then forgotten in a garage sale. It did not feel like reclaiming. It felt like maintenance, like the slow scraping of rust. People called. Friends wanted to check on me and then wanted to tell me what to do about a man who had kissed my hand at the end of summer and promised things that now sounded like props from a play. One friend suggested therapy. A cousin suggested I go on dates to remind myself I was desirable. An ex-boyfriend offered empathy with the precise distance of someone who wanted to be helpful but not invited into the wound. I appreciated them the way you appreciate bandages. They cover but do not fix. My mother moved through the house like an apology in motion. She started leaving notes, the kind people leave when they are trying to stitch a life back together with words. A post-it on the fridge read, "I am sorry," and nothing else. Another said, "I will do anything." Later, I found a list of phone numbers on the bottom of her Bible. She had called someone, or many someones. Then she stopped calling. Then she started again. Sometimes she would wait outside my door and just listen to me breathe. I would not let her in. One morning, about 2 weeks after the dinner, a woman from work on the line asked if I was going to take the day off. There had been an article. Someone had written about a local scandal and it had the kind of headline the internet loves. I did not click it. I do not trace the edges of my wounds with other people's dull teeth. He had told a version of the story to a coworker, and the coworker had told a friend, and the friend had typed it into a headline for readers who ate other people's tragedies for breakfast. The apartment building hummed with gossip like an old appliance. I turned the pages of a magazine and made my face unreadable. The police came eventually. It felt ridiculous to call them at first. What law had been broken besides the law of hearts and trust? But his exteriors had consequences. He had lied to his boss about weekends he claimed to spend with me. There were emails. There were receipts. The kind of small corruptions that, when placed beside a moral failure, become a ledger that people can read. The company did what companies do when reputations are at stake. HR emailed. Someone upstairs said she saw him pack and then scream on the curb like a wounded animal. The world pulled away its soft covers from him and let cold light fall where he had thought shadows would hide him. My mother's friends stopped coming for coffee. Some called to say they were thinking of her, and that was enough. My aunt called less often. The neighbor who had once brought casseroles avoided eye contact in elevators. People rearranged themselves around a scandal, like chairs at a funeral. It is a quiet architecture of shame. I watched at the window and learned the city's new geography. Sometimes I dreamt of my father. He had been absent 10 years, not gone, but absent in the way rivers are absent when the earth shifts. I would stand at the riverbank in my dreams and watch the water pull my father away like something that could not hold him. I would reach for him and wait cold. Grief has seasons that nobody tells you about. Mine arrived with the wrong weather and the wrong people, and yet it was honest, and therefore heavier. There were legal forms to sign, acronyms that tasted of printer ink. The apartment where we had lived together had belonged to both of us on paper, and on paper the law liked to be tidy. In practice, it was a mess of possessions and memories that neither of us could sort into boxes without cutting the skin. I signed things in offices with blue pins and watched my name in the bottom corner feel smaller, the way a dropped cup's handle looks tiny when the cup has been used too often. I could have left. I could have packed and fled as if distance could heal. I did not. Part of me wanted to stay to watch the ruin I had made for them, like a gardener who left a surprise for slugs to find. Part of me wanted to stay, because the house felt like a vessel of truth now, and I could not trust myself to put the truth in someone else's hands. Staying was not punishment. It was ownership. My mother started going to meetings at the clinic where she worked, hours that used to be too long and now were a salve. She offered to volunteer more. She tried to make amends by being useful. A neighbor told me she saw my mother serving tea at a fundraiser and the picture of her smiling felt wrong and right all at once. She had not yet learned how to be forgiven. I had not yet learned how to be gentle. People asked me if I would press charges. Parents at the school where my cousin worked wanted to know if her children would be safe around my mother. The questions were rational and ridiculous. I answered with facts. The law is not a hymn. It is a ledger. There were no criminal charges to press for what they had done. And the lack of legal remedy has a way of making the emotional wound feel like something the world is designed to ignore. We went to family therapy once because my grandmother insisted. The therapist's office smelled like lemon and something clinical. The therapist asked us to use I's statements. My mother cried. She said I am sorry. She said I was lonely. She said I felt alive. The therapist asked about boundaries. The language felt like an instruction manual for people who had not yet noticed the fire. My grandmother sat and listened and said very little. She held my hand with a strength that felt like a pulley, and I held on to it because sometimes endurance is passed down like an heirloom. Weeks stretched. The novelty of our scandal faded into a slow, steady stain on our lives. Some people forgave her, some did not. It was not my business to legislate other people's mercy. What mattered was the shape of our household now. I learned to cook different things, to make a stew that did not taste of excuses. I learned that I could not make her sorry enough for myself, and that my feelings were not a currency she could redeem with apologies. One night, months later, he sent a message that was neither apology nor request. He sent a photo. It was a photo of him alone, hair grown longer, a beard shadow forming like a stubble of regret. The caption read, "I am sorry." It did not say to whom. I opened the message with the same curiosity I might open a letter from a stranger. I thought about forwarding it to his mother, to his boss, to everyone who had once believed a better version of him. Instead, I saved the image and then deleted it. I did not want the satisfaction that comes from displaying evidence like trophies. I wanted something quieter. There is a currency of revenge I had not anticipated, the quiet life. It is the slow accumulation of days that do not revolve around you being the center of someone else's drama. It is sleep that arrives without curtains of worry, and mornings that include the bright, small joys of coffee and unhurried music. It is reading a book and not measuring the plot against my own betrayal. It is laughing at a joke that has nothing to do with his face. The quiet life is not revenge exactly. It is a reward extracted by living. My mother moved out eventually. She did not go far. She found a small apartment with a sagging balcony but a window that opened to the city. She took only what she needed, like a pilgrim who had been given permission to belong to the world again in increments. She said she was looking for work closer to the clinic and then found evenings at the church that put her footsteps in new places. She called sometimes and left messages that were tentative, as if she were learning to walk across a room without making noise. Occasionally, she would send postcards with phrases like, "Miss you," and small drawings of birds. I kept them in a box, folded, the same way you keep old receipts you might need someday. I dated. Not to mend. Not as retribution. I dated to remember how it felt for someone else to laugh at the same joke and not hold a knife behind their back. A man I met at a bookstore smiled at me and asked about my favorite author. We talked about books for 3 hours, and then walked in circles around the idea of coffee, and eventually sat on a bench and held it, the conversation easier than I expected. He did not look at my scars as a map. He asked if I liked rain. He made me tea in a mug with a chip in the rim, and I liked how his hands warmed the cup. Sometimes I thought about forgiving. Forgiveness is not a single act. It is a landscape you choose to walk across with eyes open. I tried to imagine a version of my mother where love still existed between us without the guilt. I tried and tried until my chest loosened in small places. Forgiveness, I realized, did not mean erasing what had been done. It meant setting a boundary firm enough to protect what remained. I could choose to let her back into certain rooms, and I could choose to keep other doors closed. Forgiveness was not a gift to her. It was a tool for me. There were nights when I still woke with my heart hammering at the memory of their whispering. The sound of names said in quiet can live under your skin, but the sound lost its power as the weeks stretched into months. The stone at my core, once hot and sharp, cooled further. It became something like a cornerstone. It held me, but it did not define me. I began writing things down, not legal documents or lists, but sentences. I wrote the truth out of my body like a woman bleeding, and then learning that the wound is not the totality of the self. I wrote about the way the light falls on the tablecloth. I wrote about the shape of my grandmother's hands. I wrote about revenge and how it tastes less like triumph than like a rational decision. Putting words on paper changed the taste of the memory. It gave me distance. It gave me perspective. One afternoon, my mother knocked on my door and handed me an envelope. Her hands trembled in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weather. Inside was a letter. She had written it herself, and her handwriting shook like a reed. She said she understood if I never wanted to see her again. She said she had started to go to a group that met on Thursdays where people told stories about things they had done and the people they had hurt. She said she had asked if God could ever forgive her, and an old man had laughed and said, "God does not stack mistakes the way people think. He piles them and then sprinkles light through them." She wrote she was trying. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket because sometimes the smallest things are the most dangerous. I did not read it all the way home. My grandmother called that night with an old recipe and a voice like sugar in tea. She asked if I would come over for dinner on Sunday. I said yes. The word felt heavy and right. It was not an embrace of anyone who had hurt me. It was a step. It was an invitation to keep living. Years slide by like paper in a stack. Sometimes I open a drawer and find a Polaroid of a younger me with a face I do not recognize anymore. Sometimes I smell a perfume and my chest tightens for a breath and then relaxes. People do not get neat endings. They get chapters that land on their shoulders and teach them to read differently. They get mornings that are less like alarms and more like invitations. I will not pretend the scar will ever disappear. It is a geography that shaped me. I will not pretend my mother and I are the women we were before. We are alterations. She learned to be small, and then to be large, and then to be careful. I learned to be watchful, and then to be free, and then to be human. She comes to my grandmother's house, and we sit and drink tea. And sometimes we talk about small things, and sometimes we talk about nothing. And that is enough for now. Sometimes at night, when the windows are open and the city is breathing, I stand at the sill and watch the passing lights. I think of names and promises and the way people can hold two truths at once. I think of the night I opened that door and felt the stone settle in my chest. and I think of the day I put it down like a necessary tool and then walked away with the rest of myself intact. There is a kind of justice that does not involve spectacle. It is quieter. It is the practice of claiming your days. It is the economy of small returns, sleep, food, laughter, the ability to say no without flinching. If revenge had been a banquet, I have eaten my fill. If justice had been a verdict, I keep mine in the form of a life that does not require me to prove anything to anyone but myself. I tell this story not to teach or preach, but to say that betrayal is a theft and that the tools you choose to take it back matter. Mine involved a table and a recording and an audience. Yours will be different, and that is the point. We are not supposed to be models of resilience. We are supposed to be real. We are supposed to walk forward. The stone at my core has settled into a place that does not hurt me. It is not a weapon. It is a landmark. It tells me where I have been and points to where I might go. Sometimes I lay my palm over it and feel warmth. Sometimes I press gently and remember the night and the tablecloths and the sound of a man apologizing into a room that did not take him back. I do not end in triumph. I end in a decision. I decide to keep living. I decide to let the quiet life be my revenge. I decide to make meals that do not taste like apologies. I decide to love people who are not good at being human but who try. I decide to keep my door closed to those who betray and open to those who show up. That is my verdict. If you ever find yourself standing in a hallway and you hear something you are not supposed to hear, know this. You do not have to scream. You do not have to break. You can move with industry and plan with precision. You can put the truth on the table and let the world choose. You can survive and then claim the life on the other side of the betrayal. It will not be easy. It will not be soft. It will be yours. I keep a small box of mementos. Inside are 3 things. A Polaroid of my grandmother laughing, a single white lily petal that fell on the floor that day and dried like a small prayer, and the recording. I do not play it often. Sometimes I open the box and touch the edge of the tape like one would touch a relic. It is a proof and also a memory. Proof is for the world. Memory is for me. When people ask me now what I would have done differently, I tell them one thing. I would have told the truth sooner to myself. I would have allowed the possibility that my home could be broken and still be repaired differently. I would have learned that revenge is sometimes a rational act, and that forgiveness is sometimes a piece of architecture you design for yourself. I will walk through markets and hold hands, and buy bread, and let the baker hand me the loaf with no history of hands that betrayed me. I will answer the question of whether I forgave by saying, I lived, I survived, I kept my dignity. That is the kind of justice that holds. The house grows quiet now in ways that are ordinary. The clock on the living room wall clicks along, patient and indifferent, and I listen to it and remember that time does not rush for grief. It trudges at its own pace. There are nights when I stand in the hallway and envision the door as it had been and as it is. I do not open it to look for ghosts anymore. I keep it closed so that the rooms can be rooms and not traps. This is the story I tell when people ask why I did what I did. It is not a manual. It is an account. I opened a door and I stepped into the truth, and then I put that truth on a table and I let the light find it. That is not the same as vengeance for some. For me, it was a reclamation. For me, it was a way to see the shape of my life without the dimming filter of lies. When I think about that night now, I allow myself only 3 sentences, and I say them the way a witness says what she saw without decoration. I walked down the hallway. I opened the door. I did not scream. And sometimes, when the light is kind and the city quiet, I add a 4th. I planned their ending and gave it to them in daylight, and I did not look away.